Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Welcome to our McFarland Center first event of the spring semester, and at least looks a little bit spring-like outside. I'm Tom Laney. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors a range of conferences, discussions, other programs that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. And you can see all of our events online, almost all of them online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. And this one should be on in a few days for your friends who should have been here but are not, and you can tell them what they missed. Today we're going to have an opportunity to think about some difficult moral issues related to our country's willingness to go to war, the ways that we fight these wars, who we send to fight in them, what the costs are to the people who we send, and how the forms of contemporary warfare and politics we engage in allow most everyone else to be comfortably distanced from those costs. There's a lot here for us to think about. Phil Klay, our speaker today, is an author, teacher, and veteran of the United States Marine Corps, which he entered upon graduation from Dartmouth College. His short story collection, Redeployment, won the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction and the National Book Critics Circle Award, John Leonard Prize, for Best Debut Work in Any Genre. It was selected as one of the 10 best books of 2014 by the New York Times. His 2020 novel, Missionaries, was a New York Times notable book. In the last decade, his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, and the Brookings Institution's essay series, among other places. In his newest book, Uncertain Ground, Citizenship in the Age of Endless, Invisible War, reflects on what has become a reality for all of us living in America, relatively sheltered from the intense and never-ending conflicts in other parts of the world, yet still forced to consider who we are as citizens. Given the questions raised here, we're pleased to be co-sponsoring with the Peace and Conflict Studies program, and I'm grateful to Professor Tim Joseph and his colleagues for their support. So please join me in welcoming Phil Klay.
Thank you so much. Oh, that is working. Excellent. It is awesome to be here. Are there any Marines in the audience? Hoorah. And we got a ROTC program here. Folks going into the Army?
Army, Navy, Marine Corps.
Okay, I'm so sorry. It's okay. Yeah. Marines, we love the Army, you know. It's great, you need an Army. The Space Force of the land, we call it. Okay, I am going to talk for a little bit to you guys, and then hopefully we'll just be able to have a conversation. So I wanted to begin with this sort of unusual thing that I saw on Instagram. And geopolitics don't generally turn on the political statements put out by obscure theater groups. But that didn't prevent a guy that I went to college with from announcing on World AIDS Day that until the New York Theater Workshop condemned Israel's actions in Gaza, he would no longer take his HIV medication. The comments to this post were full of heart emojis, including one from an American author primarily famous for embarrassing herself on social media. Over subsequent posts, he would go on to denounce Israel, celebrate Palestine. A later post of red, green, and black Mexican sweetbreads declared the conchas are also free Palestine, and document his progress using the hashtag #HowManyTcells. Set aside whether theater companies issuing statements has much impact on foreign wars. That's not why the post struck me. I too, after all, had once declared myself willing to risk my life for a country. Some details differed. This was May 2005 when I signed my name and swore an oath and accepted my commission as an officer in the United States Marine Corps. For the occasion, I wore my recently purchased dress blues, the most expensive piece of clothing I'd ever and would ever purchase, a form-fitting straitjacket of a uniform which supposedly was a automatic panty dropper, though it didn't arouse my girlfriend at the time so much as make her sad. Right before I put pen to paper, someone, I forget who, pointed out that my signature put my life at risk, that I wouldn't own myself anymore, and that my bodily integrity, mental soundness, and survival were theoretically on the line. That was fine. I didn't really think it would happen, but it lent a pleasing gravitas to the moment, one generally absent from the lives of the young and the privileged. I signed, feeling adult and serious and a touch noble. Our national project at the time involved many things. One of them was force-feeding the nations of Iraq and Afghanistan our own conception of what national aspiration should look like. Abstract principles like democracy and free markets and rule of law were being applied to very specific countries with very specific social and political and cultural conditions, none of which were being taken into account, or rather which were starting to be taken into account more and more. Nor was the long-term after effects of violence, the ways in which the second and third order effects of war could reshape societies and change even the best laid plans for a just post-war future. Unsurprisingly then, things weren't going so well when I joined up, and when I deployed to Iraq, it was part of the surge, an increase in troops and change in tactics designed to halt the spiraling violence that was taking over the country. For a time it worked, with the violence going down temporarily, only for Iraq several years later to explode again with the rise of ISIS, taking it through more war, through genocide and further sectarian fracturing of its already ill-functioning democracy. But I'd left the military by then, getting out in 2009, passing an opportunity to deploy to Afghanistan as part of Obama's surge, in which Marines I knew would be killed or injured, only for the country to later fall to the Taliban. In the aftermath, as a country, we would leave most of our Afghan allies to their uncertain fates as we retreated back, like Tom and Daisy Buchanan, into our money and our vast carelessness. This carelessness horrified me. A few months after the fall of Kabul, I spoke with a man I'll call Walid, who used to work for Americans, over FaceTime. When I asked him to describe how it felt when the Taliban took Kabul, Walid, from Kabul itself, gave me a nervous smile, looking almost embarrassed. "Sorry, sir, I can't say," he said. "I can't try to describe that feeling." Walid has 4 children, 3 of them girls, who kept asking him what this meant for them, what it meant for their schooling, for their future. But there were more immediate problems for Walid. Since he used to work for the Americans, his life was at risk. He'd already had to flee his home once before after a threat to his daughter's school. How desperate would life become with the Taliban fully in charge? Over a WhatsApp video call, though, Walid's voice was gentle, his manner polite, with a kind of resigned calm in his voice. Whatever he said, no matter how shocking, he delivered in an understated, matter-of-fact tone. As we were talking, Walid walked into a bedroom and tilted his phone to show the large bed where all his children were sleeping in their rented Kabul apartment. It was 9 p.m., too early to go to sleep, and yet he explained what else did they have to do those days but sleep and dream. "When a person loses their hope, their future, you can't think for the future," Walid said, looking at his daughter's faces with an expression of such adoration it was painful to see. "For 1 week after the Americans pulled out from Afghanistan, we didn't eat anything. All my daughters say, 'I'm not hungry.'" On the phone, he showed me each one of their sleeping faces. Then he walked out of their bedroom and said, "I have a lot of plans for my life for my children. And now I don't have any plans. We lost everything. Our home, our plans, our future. This is our real life. It doesn't have anything." What's especially peculiar about speaking with a man in Walid's situation is that almost anyone in the United States could have had the power to save Walid's family or at least help try. That's quite literally true. And not in the abstract ways in which debates about refugees and immigration go, in which a more engaged citizenry can always push for better policy to help more people. During the last days of the U.S. troop presence in Afghanistan, random citizens, many with no qualifications, no special knowledge about immigration or refugee work, found themselves with the undeserved power to help decide which Afghans could leave. Getting an Afghan on a plane out was and remains a complex process. Our immigration system doesn't work during the best of times, and it's not at all suited for crisis. This was especially the case During the pullout from Afghanistan, admissions had slowed to a crawl under the Trump presidency, which had been particularly hostile to accepting refugees from Muslim countries. So there was a huge backlog. But as the Taliban began making gains, more and more people began requesting visas. Seeing a catastrophe coming, people in the humanitarian community were advocating for increased urgency from the Biden administration and the adoption of best practices learned during previous evacuations in Vietnam and Kosovo and other places. But from the Biden administration, there was almost no interest. Everyone expected some level of humanitarian disaster. They didn't expect the complete and immediate collapse of the Afghan government, or the fall of Kabul by mid-August, or the crowds of desperate Afghans rushing the Hamid Karzai airport, some so desperate to leave they clung to the sides of aircraft taking off. Civilian volunteers began working the bureaucracy, trying to help Afghans in crisis navigate our system, and sometimes being given slots on buses or vans to get out. This meant untrained, often idealistic people making brutally pragmatic decisions in a chaotic, fast-moving environment. I spoke to one guy named Abram who got involved in the work because his interpreter had saved his life when he deployed as a soldier in Afghanistan, and he felt he should try to help other deserving Afghans get out. Rapidly, though, he discovered the process wasn't about who deserved to get out or who was in the most danger or who had sacrificed the most during 2 decades of war. There were people who might have been more qualified, but there would be complications that could leave them in limbo. On his second day on the job, Abram got in contact with a doctor and former minister in the government with a very large family, a woman on a kill list who had been beaten so badly by the Taliban she'd ended up in the hospital. She couldn't be there under her own name, that put her at risk, so some of her doctor friends hid her under an assumed name. She had fluid in her lungs and a chest tube inserted, and when Abram tried to reach out to help her get documentation, there was misunderstanding from the beginning. She thought we had a red, white, and blue Black Hawk helicopter that could fly her to America and to safety, Abram told me. This was a constant problem. So many of the Afghans were used to thinking of America as this omnipresent, incredible power, not as an incompetent bureaucratic mess. And she thought, Abram said, that we were actively choosing not to save her. She really had a true sense that we felt her life was less important than other people's. The real problem was documentation. Abram didn't know who all the members of her family were by name and identification number, and from the bureaucratic perspective, her case was a non-starter. But from her perspective, look at it this way. You've been beaten almost to death by the Taliban, you have a chest tube draining fluid from your lungs in a hospital where you're being treated at in secret, and while recovering from one attack and figuring out how to stay alive and avoid the next, you also somehow need to obtain a mountain of government documents from a collapsing government so that you can file it with the clogged and labyrinthine and unresponsive bureaucracy of another. It was hopeless. We went through all the stages of grief, Abram told me. At one point, she was leaving voice memos in where she pleaded, crying for her life. And then there were periods of rage. He told me, during the time when we were going through her incredible anger towards us, she said, "Why are our lives not worth saving?" And that was devastating, because there's nobody I've interacted with who I would say your life is not worth saving. We're not the first generation to see such stark choices and situations. In an essay entitled "How Much Home Does a Person Need?", the Austrian-born writer Jean Amery described a moment in Belgium where his little resistance group faced capture. Working in a girl's apartment, they were producing anti-Nazi propaganda flyers when a German who happened to live below, disturbed by the noise they were making, walked up the stairs, pounded on the door, and stepped into the room. There he was, an SS man with black lapels displaying the insignia of the Secret Service, and there they were, pale with deadly fear, because in the next room sat all their implements of propaganda, work which would one day lead to the death of the brave girl who owned the apartment, and would lead Amery himself to torture at Breendonk, followed by shipment to Auschwitz, then Buchenwald, then Bergen-Belsen, where he would be liberated by the Brits in 1944. On that day, though, they were safe. The SS man, tired from night duty, only bellowed that he wanted peace and quiet. What frightened Amery most about the episode, though, was that the SS man bellowed his demand in Amery's native dialect. Here was his regional compatriot, a Viennese perhaps, like him. I had not heard this accent for a long time, Amri wrote, and for this reason there stirred within me the mad desire to answer him in his own dialect. Alongside fear surged feelings of intimacy, a desire to share regional patriotism with this hunter of Jews, an irrational instinct followed by a rational, if horrific, conclusion. At that moment, I understood completely and forever that my home was enemy country. One's home is one's home, whether we like it or not, whether we, as Amri would, come to repudiate it. The instinctual intimacy he felt with the SS man was a product of his childhood and youth, his first loves, family memories, his earlier conscious dawnings to the world at large. For Amri, there's no new home, only exile, a state of self-loathing and self-destruction, since the repudiated home nevertheless persists as a part of you forever. He does concede, though, that future generations might be able to get along without a homeland, products of a technological and scientific revolution. Perhaps for future generations, quote, the objects of daily use, which at present we still imbue with emotion, will be fully fungible. Modern man will trade his home for the world, flying from Paris to New York, Shanghai to Buenos Aires, in a world alien to the concept of home where, quote, the cities, highways, service stations, the furniture, the electric household appliances, the plates and the spoons will be the same everywhere. Then we will all be citizens of the world, a hollow victory, since it will be a victory over an essential part of human nature, as we turn our cities to malls, our public spaces to airport lobbies. Doesn't that sound a little bit like the world us wealthy Americans are creating for ourselves? The products we consume produced by multinational corporations, offering us choice selections from a global menu that for all its variety seems strangely homogenized. We need not shop to get goods, go to a restaurant to have meals prepared for us, even go to bars to meet someone romantically. We're as social as ever, but increasingly we satisfy our desire for community through easily created and easily dissolved online communities rather than communities formed by proximity, such as the church or the workplace. Have you seen those videos of people with the Apple Vision Pro goggles? These like folks in public transport engulfed in this private and inaccessible world, batting at the air like cats chasing a laser pointer. Such folks inhabit a truly global world, albeit one most Afghans will never inhabit. For my part, though, I'm no such digital citizen of the world. I'm an American. I'm a Queens resident. I'm a father, a Catholic. My kids play baseball for Sacred Heart and compete in our Cub Scout Pinewood Derby in the basement of a church a few blocks from our home. That's where I stand, and it's from there that I act. As Iraq was falling into chaos, a friend asked me what the experience of war had done to my idealism. He might have said patriotism, since that's ultimately how I took the question. If you serve in the military in a morally complicated war, at some point you begin asking your questions about how to live ethically in a world structured by often corrupt institutions, and what to make of the nation whose flag you wear on your sleeve. It's a hard task figuring that out. And when you're analyzing your relationship to the wars that you've been a part of and the wars that your country is engaged in, both Democrats and Republican administrations have worked to make it harder. In both the Obama and Biden administrations, Americans were told that the wars were over, even as America continued dropping bombs, deploying troops to increase the lethality of local fighters, and providing resources, intelligence assets, technology, training, and know-how in a variety of asymmetric conflicts. After the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, Joe Biden gave a celebratory speech where he claimed to have ended 20 years of war, only to then announce that we will maintain the fight against terrorism in Afghanistan and other countries by relying on over-the-horizon capabilities instead of ground troops. In other words, we were called to celebrate the end of a war while being assured that the killing would continue nonetheless, as if by magic. To understand the magic behind that continued killing, we have to not only look closer at how the United States is using its might, but at a whole variety of countries with political or economic interests in death. There's a scene in my novel Missionaries where I describe a targeted killing in which an American-trained mercenary from Colombia views the video feed of a Chinese-made drone hovering over a funeral in Yemen and communicates with an Emirati pirate over a Swedish communications network to help drop an American-supplied bomb on a Houthi tribesman. It's no flight of fancy on my part. It's just one of the ways that we kill these days. That poses challenges, not just to the writer, but to the citizen. You have to be able to conceptualize a system designed to have no human face, designed to be illegible to the average citizen. One small example of things that people do. In the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, the Biden administration has twice bypassed congressional review to approve emergency weapons sales to Israel, while the Senate voted down a resolution demanding a report on whether Israel has committed human rights violations. Whichever side you fall on in terms of our supply of weapons to Israel, I find it highly dubious in a democracy to actively pursue less debate over and more ignorance about a highly contentious war being waged with, at the very least, an acceptance of civilian casualties radically beyond what America deemed acceptable when it was waging its own wars. When I signed my name and swore my oath and became a Marine officer back in 2005, that was not my image of the democracy I'd signed up to serve. But I still have that yearning, that intense need to serve something larger than myself. And I would be lying if I told you that yoking that desire to the stars and stripes, as much as it has given me tremendous pride, has not also at times been heartbreaking. One response to this is bitterness. There's a famous Navy SEAL, the author of a tell-all memoir, who, whenever there's something in American life that displeases him, likes to tweet things like, "I can't believe I killed for you morons." This is probably the most pathetic and narcissistic route. There are also, though, other national causes. I've got so many friends who have somehow ended up in Ukraine, and others with the blue and yellow flags always adorning their social media posts. It gives the satisfaction of a less morally ambiguous conflict, a national cause to throw their support into. For the folks who've gone over there, they found the work rewarding, but more morally ambiguous than they thought it initially might have been. Other folks, friends on the left who are wary of the military-industrial complex and the way Ukraine was seized upon by neocons as a validation of their preferences for a muscular American military presence around the world, were quiet on the Ukraine cheerleading, but have thrown themselves into support for Palestine. People who would sneer at a robust display of American patriotism. At one event at a local bookstore, a worker, local to me, a worker reported feeling threatened because a patron came in wearing a shirt displaying an American flag. How frightening. These folks were wholeheartedly embracing the national symbols of other countries and movements, often countries and movements with their own complex moral histories. America First conservatives never tire of throwing accusations at Ukraine, while boosters of Israel enjoy pointing out that while Representative Rashida Tlaib might insist that from the river to the sea is an aspirational call for freedom, human rights, and peaceful coexistence, not death, destruction, and hate, the phrase undeniably has been used for decades as part of the call for either the dissolution of Israel and the expulsion of vast swaths of Israeli Jews, as it appeared in PLO statements from the 1960s, or as a call for mass Jewish murder, as in more contemporary statements by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. National movements, no matter how sympathetic in the moment, how worthy of support, are also, when looked at coldly, almost always ugly in places, sometimes hideously so. Nonetheless, I'm not sure why I feel such disquiet when I see a How Many T-Cells post urging once again for that theater group to denounce the Israeli war. Like so many veterans, I've often wished that the public writ large would approach war with a sense of the vast human cost of the thing. Like many veterans, I've felt alienated and slightly superior to the disconnected American public who rarely thought about our wars. Not simply the ones we were fighting directly, but which we were implicated in through various forms of military support. Like many veterans, I've wished that we would undo the tangle of laws and practices that have removed war-making from public debate. And I've wished more people would act like they had a personal stake in foreign wars. And also personally, I look at this particular war and see massive human suffering and no clear articulation of anything approaching a just end state from an Israeli government with prominent members who are often happy to cheer anti-Palestinian violence and who have openly advocated ethnic cleansing. In short, the way the war is being carried out and the major concerns about the direction the war is taking bother me as an American patriot, somebody who believes in American ideals and feels implicated in the war by our government's support for it. suppose one response to that post and why I feel uneasy about it is to say that the stand is absurd. It doesn't really matter whether a theater workshop condemns the violence. I believe in art, but not in that way. And the gravity of what he's doing, risking his health, is so mismatched by the demand he's making that it renders the whole project a kind of narcissistic moral exhibitionism, which is a common trap when it comes to activism around war. But I also reject the whole premise underlying this and its relationship to the art world, a world I hold dear and actually think is extremely important in dehumanizing times, especially times of war. What we need in the present moment are clear artistic articulations of who we are in relation to our nation, to the violence done in our name, to the violence done with our support, some of which is justified, some of which is necessary. We do not need statements about geopolitics from theater workshops or writer collectives. We especially don't need the underlying assumption that a writer's politics must in some way align with a particular cause. We need one thing and one thing only: good art, art that helps us know ourselves and our place in society, which is that precondition for knowing how to act in society. And different times call for different artistic responses. After World War II and the catastrophic destruction it entailed, writers set their sights on a wholesale rejection of the society which enabled. Nationalism gets undermined here. We get styles that emphasize absurdity, farce, that refuse to grant the world dignity even in its monstrousness. For Joseph Heller's Yossarian in Catch-22, the world is not grand, it's trying to kill him. And Thomas Pynchon's world in Gravity's Rainbow is a vast but horrifying interconnected web trapping human flies by the tens and hundreds of thousands, where, quote, a million bureaucrats are diligently plotting death, and some of them even know it. Understanding this and accepting the appropriate level of cynicism is what modern war literature has tried to teach us so often that it's become its own cliché. As modern men and women, we've been disabused of the old lie about war. No, you're not supposed to suggest lofty ideals have any place in a subject so ugly. I had seen nothing sacred, Hemingway told us in A Farewell to Arms. And the things that were glorious had no glory, and the sacrifices were like the stockyards at Chicago if nothing was done with the meat except to bury it. There were many words that you could not stand to hear, and finally only the names of places had dignity. Certain numbers were the same way, and certain dates, and these with the names of the places were all you could say and have them mean anything. Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hollow were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the numbers of roads, the names of rivers, the numbers of regiments, and the dates. Okay, Ernie. And yet there's that word dignity that he uses. It's an abstraction like the rest, but it's deeply felt. Perhaps we're not so cynical as we think we are. Yes, Hemingway is rejecting some abstractions, but only those that have drifted from reality or seem to paper over ugliness. The seemingly concrete names of villages and the numbers of roads are not simple matter, but gesture towards blood and pain and sacrifice, as well as the respect such things are due. War, as Simone Weil noted, is the province of force that makes people things. And this is done not simply through the act of killing, but through the habits of perception war teaches us. To his regiment, division and up, wrote James Jones, who served in the Battle of Guadalcanal during the Second World War, each infantry private is one of a large number of statistical risks, a fact of which each infantry private is well aware. Death for the soldier is a matter of arbitrary chance, totally reasonless and pointless from the viewpoint of the individual. It only has meaning when it is viewed numerically from a higher echelon by those who count the ciphers. But 21st century war adds in a further layer of abstraction. The killing can be done from exceptional distance, with almost no cost or notice by the population waging it. So modern war is the province of abstract systems causing very real damage to human flesh. The question for the war writer, I think, is to capture both those systems which obliterate the human, seek to reduce it to mere materiality, and to call witness to all that is actually present in the concrete physical world. And I'll give you my attempt to approach this. This is just the very beginning of my novel Missionaries, which is told in the voice of Abel, a kid from a very poor rural region of Colombia, which intermittently experiences state and political violence. My town sat on top of a small hill, by the side of a river whose banks held only sand. At noon, you had to walk quickly so as not to burn your feet, but when it rained, the river would overflow and turn our central street to mud. All us children would go out, slipping and pushing each other, playing in the mud before the sun baked it hard and the wind carried it away as dust. To talk about this part of my life is to talk about another person, like a person in a story, a boy with a father and mother and 3 sisters, one pretty, one smart, and one mean. A grandfather who drank too much and beat everyone at dominoes, a teacher who thought that boy had talent, a priest who thought he was wicked. Friends and classmates and enemies and girls he watched with increasing wonder, like Jimena, who had thick curly hair and fair skin and who got pregnant with the baby of one of the local guerrilleros. Most people think that a person is whatever you see before you, walking around in bone and meat and blood, but that is an idiocy. Bone and meat and blood just exists, but to exist is not to live. And bone and meat and blood alone is not a person. A person is what happens when there is a family and a town, a place where you're known, where every person who knows you holds a small invisible mirror, and in each mirror, held by families and friends and enemies, is a different reflection. In one mirror, the sweet fat boy I was to my father, in another the little imp I was to my mother, in another the irritating brat I was to Gustavo. A person is what happens when you gather all these reflections around a body. So what happens when one by one the people holding those mirrors are taken from you? It's simple. The person dies, and the bone and meat and blood goes on, walking the earth as if the person still existed, when God and the angels know he doesn't. So it's the beginning of Missionaries. And I wanted to read you that because that's a novel that deals with all these things in their complexity and goes through many of the ways in which we wage war for good and ill. But the first question that concerned me was basically what a human being is and what exactly violence does to the human beyond the obvious. And the answer to that question, I think, must lie beyond what we can find in modern individualism. Those who've read Mauriac or some other the 20th century Catholic writers might note some of the influence of personism in that passage. The violence in war doesn't simply punch holes in people's bodies, but in complex social and cultural and political structures. The lesson of the past 20 years for me have been that it's the changes to those structures that determine the fate of wars and nations. And so understanding my characters not as individual actors, but as ensouled persons within a complex web of the relations is the first step to understanding not only their own psychology, but understanding what war and violence is in the first place. That means understanding ourselves not just as individuals, but as members of communities, of towns, and crucially of nations. Which means we don't just need political science and technological sophistication, we need art and philosophy and literature that allows us to feel and know who we are. We need to learn to know ourselves if we want to deal with modern war, and then we must act accordingly. Thank you.
Captain Hopkins, NROTC, and this isn't even on, so it doesn't matter.
Recording, but you can't hear it yet.
Okay, good. All right, question for you.
Yeah.
You made a conscious decision to serve, then move on. What was that tipping point for you that said, that's it for me in the Marine Corps?
Well, you know, I never intended to do more than 4 years, right? I think that people go into the military with very different sort of plans, right? And I wouldn't have joined if we weren't at war, you know? I was always interested in foreign policy, you know. Service was very important to me, very important in my family. You know, my father had been in the Peace Corps, my mother worked in international medical aid for many years. My maternal grandfather had worked for the Foreign Service for many years. My dad's father had served in World War II, actually. So service to country was something very important in the family. I was not like a kid who was interested in the military, though. I never would have done it necessarily had we not had wars on. But then I go to college in 2001, and there is soon, I'm actually in the woods in New Hampshire, and we meet hikers who are like, somebody flew a plane into the World Trade Center, and we're like, you can't fool us just because we're away from civilization with your crazy stories. And then we keep hearing it, we're like, oh my God, this really happened. Very soon we're in Afghanistan, and then we're gearing up for Iraq. And so if I wanted to serve my country, that was the way to do it, right? And it's funny, right? I think that I have a friend. It's sort of interesting, right? Because he once said to me, he's like, I know it's I shouldn't feel this, but he said, even now, I have difficulty trusting people of our generation who didn't sign up, right? I know it's an all-volunteer military, right? But the all-volunteer military is a trick question. If you have any honor, you're supposed to say yes, right? And I think that I talked about that veteran superiority that comes in. I think there's that feeling of our country's at war. I have a responsibility to this nation, which I still feel, and that was to me the most logical way to carry it out. But I never anticipated doing it for more than 4 years. And so, in a way, joining totally kind of derailed all my other life plans. I was going to go into the Foreign Service. I don't know what I was going to do, but I was young, so it wasn't like I had a bad experience in the military and then left. I felt pretty good about everything when I left, and I still, feel good about my service. Just I feel I have a lot of complicated feelings about the ways that I think, particularly our political leadership, has used the lives of service members, right? How could you not feel that?
I appreciate it. I could use all the salvation I can.
As you were saying earlier about how your friend asked you about what the war in our country's actions had on your sense of your patriotism and your idealism. So what effect did it have on that?
Yeah, look, it bruises and batters your patriotism, but look, I think an overly idealistic view of these things is ultimately not helpful. That's why I brought up the examples of sort of Ukraine and Palestine. It's not like you can't take sides in these things, and I actually think that as an American implicated in both of these wars, you have a responsibility to think through what you feel about these wars and what we should be doing and how involved we are. You should be engaging with those questions. But what I resist very much is the attempt to sort of whitewash any of these things, right? Whether it's I'm identifying with the victim and therefore I don't need to think seriously, about the sort of complex moral history, whether it's in Ukraine or Palestine, right? Or what this is going to look like on the ground. And I think the same thing for your relationship to yourself as an American citizen. I think that a patriotism that cannot look honestly at what America is doing is a brittle patriotism, or a cowardly one, right? But I don't think that we disengage then, right? Or somehow attempt to wash our hands of it, which strikes me as a bullshit gesture anyway, I know one guy who was so upset by American wars, he's decided to live off the grid and not pay taxes, and that has a huge, huge impact on his potentials in life. And I'm like, okay, you are definitely living your truth, so I respect that, I suppose, not my choice, but yeah, I think that it's good to get your idealism battered about a bit, as long as you keep it, right? There's a bit from Derek Walcott in his Nobel speech says, the love that pastes together the shattered fragments of a vase is greater than the love that took its symmetry for granted when it was whole. Not an exact quote, but you get the idea, right? I think that it's good to have your image of whatever it is that you believe in, whatever it is that you're throwing your heart and soul into, whatever broader project that is. And I don't think that you can have meaning in this world unless you're part of some sort of broader institution and project. It's good to have that vase shattered, and collecting those shattered pieces and pasting them back together is, I think, an important aspect of being a mature human being with a robust idealism intact.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your reflections on this. I really appreciate this. I might have missed this. I apologize. I got here a few minutes late. But in general, I'd love to hear your thinking about 50 years after the end of the draft and
Sure.
our all-volunteer force and the absolute declining rate. Most people in this room probably have no family members and
Yep.
no relation to anybody who's ever been in the military.
Yeah.
That, along with our representatives, you look at those percentages, and that number is incredibly shrinking and lower every single year.
Yeah.
People who are making the decisions to this, and I'm sorry if you already addressed this, but
No.
there's an endpoint you can see to this, along with the technological issues that you described so well and powerfully, that's really frightening about how does a free democratic society possibly keep this going in that trajectory without changing some substantive way that we make these decisions.
Well, part of what we've done is we've changed the way that we wage wars, and I think part of it is to evade political accountability, and part of it is because of the changing nature of war. So, Iraq and Afghanistan, we had a heavy reliance on contractors, right? And there were places where armed contractors there in Afghanistan where their casualty rate was about 50% higher than that of Americans, right? Now, one of the benefits of that, there are a variety of reasons that we might do that, but one of the political benefits of that is that Americans don't really care when they die, okay? It also allows you to sort of have the numbers artificially low. So when then President Donald Trump sort of like asked for a withdrawal of troops from Syria via Twitter, there were these like weird shell games that went on because the military, this is one of those things that I feel, again, very complicated about because like I've been to refugee camps in northern Iraq where they're like, if that withdrawal had gone through the way that he wanted, we would have had 100,000 refugees because in the regions where we did pull out, Turkish-backed militias just went through and ethnically cleansed the region of Kurds. And I've met some of those people. I've been in tents with like a father with like pins all down his leg from a rocket attack, 2 sons and a pregnant wife being like, what, you guys used us to fight ISIS and now just discarded us. And I understand that. I understand why he would feel that way. And at the same time, like the commander-in-chief issued an order, and then the military and the, not ambassador, but like the special, I forget his title, special representative of that region, were later like, he was like bragging about basically flim-flamming the administration about how many troops we were keeping, right? And one of the pieces of that was like you'd have a base where there'd be a relatively low number of actual uniformed military and maybe 3 or 4 times that number of contractors. And there are all sorts of other things. So heavy reliance on proxies and other things. It is sustainable in one way in that there's very low political downside. But one of the things that you do when you're not expending political capital on American wars, which means that, we have troops overseas. Sometimes they get killed in places that Americans don't even know we've been engaged in, in combat about, because we've been using the same authorization for the use of military force from 2001 to justify it in this like sort of rapidly expanding definition of who counts as associated forces of Al-Qaeda. And what that means is that the president isn't going before Congress and saying, we need to expand the mission in the Horn of Africa. And this is important. And this is why. And this is how much it's going to cost. And these are the risks. And this is what we want to achieve. And then have Congress vote on it. That doesn't happen, which means that there's no political base behind these American wars, right? There's no political support for it. And it means that soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen themselves They're not having their own mission articulated to them by their elected leaders, so it feels very weird and nebulous to them. I remember one Marine in Helmand saying to a reporter, like, "This war is dumb, but whatever, our country's in it," right? It's not, it's not how you want your troops to feel, right? But if you're not making a public case to war, you're not making a case to the actual people who are fighting it out. And so,
What do you imagine is ever going to change this dynamic?
what do I think is going to change this? Well, you know, I thought my op-eds and essays would just really.
Aside from that.
I think there is a great deal of skepticism about the way that we have been waging war. That's very clear. And you see it in the debates over Ukraine and whatever. I often think that the ways that gets sort of filtered through the political process is horrible, right? And, you know, it's one of the reasons why you need good moral leadership, is because, like, the American people can provide, like, a good base of discontent, right? Like, the American people know when they're getting screwed, right? Your average Lance Corporal, your average Joe knows when he's getting screwed, right? He might not know, you know, what the correct policy should be in this region. Oftentimes, Joe has some ideas that are decidedly not good, right? Sometimes he has some good ideas. But he does know if things are screwed up. And you need people to be able to actually harness that, recognize it, understand what's happening, and channel it towards, like, improvement in the system. I do think that, you know, we've been kind of sleepwalking through it because we've had, frankly, cowardly political decisions have been made in terms of war. And I think that, you know, it is interesting to me to see if this particular conflict will be an inflection point, because now you have American service members, right, who are being drawn into this in places where, you know, Americans haven't thought about in years. And that does put more pressure on the system, but I don't think you're going to have any major changes. I don't think you're going to be going back to a draft. Some people talk about a draft like this is going to solve our problems. I don't think it's going to solve our problems. I don't think we're ever really going back to that unless, you know, something really catastrophic happens, because we've learned this is a new way that you can wage war, and it's too politically useful. And also, like, there are genuine benefits to it, right? Being able to very effectively help proxies with military support and intelligence while keeping our hands relatively clean, you know, that was a very useful thing for us in the early stage of the Ukraine war, for example, right?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And in a way, it follows up on Sean's question. You know, my closest relative who fought in a war fought in Vietnam. So I'm not around as many veterans, and you're engaged in a lot of veterans conversations and
Yeah.
things. And you also talked about the role of the arts and literature in that. Can you
Sure.
help me think about what would I know if I were around more younger veterans? What would I hear and learn that I might not hear and learn, except maybe in your op-eds? And are there ways that you can talk about that the arts, that literature, you think has engaged and helped them?
Yeah, oh, for sure. I mean, it's deeply important to be able to engage with people asking the same sorts of questions, you know, circling around similar experiences, right? And also, art can be a kind of bridge. Probably the best compliment I've ever received about my work was a couple telling me, and this has happened more than once actually, that they read my book together and would talk about each story on a sort of nightly basis, and, like, the spouse who had been deployed, who hadn't talked about his experience before, kind of starting to incorporate some stories from his deployment as they talked about, you know, a fictional work that they both could inhabit, right? That, like, it serves as a kind of touch point, I suppose, between experience. And that's really what you want with art, that, you know, you can only live one life, but art opens you up to all these different types of experiences, and gives you a foothold for talking about them in a richer way. And And also, it's just, I think that you go through anything intense. People talk about trauma with veteran experiences, and there can be a therapeutic component to writing, for example, if you've undergone trauma. But even setting that aside, anything intensely important to you, you need to sort of think about and process over time, right? Good or bad, or good and bad at the same time, right? And the deeper and weightier the sort of moral, spiritual questions that an experience raises for you, the more essential it is for you to be able to engage with it through art or art making, I think. And, art is the way that we ask ourselves who we are and how we find it out. And so I don't think it's something narrowly related to veterans. I think it's just an essential part of being a human being, right? I was reading a Guy Davenport essay about the caves at Lascaux and how, I think it might have been William Randolph Hearst who had created the image of, the prehistoric man is this like heavily eyebrowed thug with a club, and oh no, actually he was like a beautiful artist painting with incredible sensitivity. It's just a fundamental thing in terms of who we are. We don't know who we are until we start talking about it and until we start trying to communicate it to other people, right? Experience, and sort of related to that thing I was talking about, the sort of mirrors and the reflections, right? If you have an experience that's just sort of entirely inside you, you only know a limited amount about it, right? To give you a sort of mundane example, right? Like, okay, I don't think that just because you've been through something makes you the ultimate arbiter of what that means, right? I have been through X, therefore I can determine what it means. That's not how human beings work, right? And we know this in like, all right, your friend comes to you and they start complaining about their girlfriend or their boyfriend, and they're like, they're being such an asshole, right? And then like 5 minutes into the conversation, you're like, actually, you're the asshole, right? Like, that's being a good friend. That's us with everything we experience, right? We need other people to reflect things back at us that are us, but seen through a different angle, and that's how we grow and learn and are able to process things, and art is one of the richest ways that you can do that.
Thanks for being here and for your talk and for talking with us now. And my question is sort of a follow-up to some of the questions that have already come up. I appreciate your point about U.S. citizens, investment or complicity
Yeah.
in these wars, and also your point about the whitewashing of what is happening with our investment and complicity. And so you spoke a bit about, in response to an earlier question, about possible political solutions, and you've spoken about, in response to Tom's question, about how the arts can address this state that we're in. What more should the press be doing? So, I mean, this is kind of a
well, so
vast
there's things that the press should be doing, but I think one of the things is, so first off, we need to have the military be more responsive to the press, right? More open to embeds, more open to allowing them to actually cover what the military is doing, right? We have become very comfortable with a situation where the press has been kept out of being able to cover American wars, right? Shutting down embeds, not allowing access. One of the things with the style of warfare, one of the appeals of the style of warfare is, drones, special operations. Oh, it's all very classified. We don't allow embeds. We don't allow reporters to cover this stuff. You could allow reporters to cover this stuff if you wanted to. All of a sudden, the most secret stuff in the world, as soon as it's politically useful, gets leaked to high heaven. How soon did we have every detail about the Osama bin Laden raid? Why? Because the people in charge felt it was useful to them, right? We should demand that, right? It should be a standard. There should be a much higher bar to not allowing the press, right? I think it's very easy to blame the press when there are also decisions that we are making as a nation that make it much more difficult. There are other sort of political things, right? I mean, I think if we're going to be engaged militarily, I think the president should have to justify that on a regular basis. I don't think we should ever have open-ended authorizations for the use of military force, period. I mentioned, Biden bypassing congressional review for arms sales to Israel. I do not like that, right? I don't like that, regardless of the cause and regardless of whether I support it or not, right? I think that we need a lot more transparency and accountability within the system, more places for Congress to get involved in war making, which is the way that it's supposed to be. I mean, God, the founders didn't even want there to be a standing army, right? When the nation was founded, they wanted us to rely on the militias system, which was crazy because militias are terrible fighters and they got their asses kicked in the Indian Wars. And then Congress was like, okay, we'll have a standing army because a bunch of randos with the muskets that they keep in their barn are not good fighters, and having professionals is actually pretty good. But
Yeah, could I follow up real quick?
Yeah.
Could you speak about I'm interested in this, in the history of the loss of embedded. So what is the history of embedded journalists, and when did this become?
So, okay, all right. There are a lot of embeds when I'm in Iraq. And also, when I was in Iraq, we had a huge number of troops, a lot of ground troops. And then what happens is, so Barack Obama comes in as the sort of darling of the anti-war left, right? Because he had voted against the Iraq war. Famously, he was like, I'm against stupid wars. He'd supported Afghanistan. He comes in, and the idea is to draw down the troop presence in Iraq, which is relatively quiet at the time, right, in terms of the level of violence compared to certainly 2006, 2005. And then he does this troop surge in Afghanistan, but it's a short troop surge where we're supposed to bring government in a box to Helmand province, and the whole thing doesn't really work. Into these very, very violent areas that are basically controlled by the Taliban, and sort of as soon as we leave, they kind of go back. But he, in 2011, pulled troops out of Iraq, and don't quote me on the timeline, but yeah, he pulls troops out of Iraq. He announces the end of the war. Okay, and then you have a series of kind of political developments in Iraq that widen the sectarian divide significantly, which is already pretty wide. And then ISIS comes back with a vengeance and begins taking city after city, right? And just rampaging its way through Iraq, massacring people, committing genocide, et cetera, making its way, taking Mosul. And during this time, we start sending troops back in, advisors, right? Now, if you have just very publicly, as the candidate who came to power as the darling of the anti-war left, declared that the war is over, you don't want to go, hey guys, guess what? We're doing Iraq war again. The Obama administration also had an expansive notion of presidential war-making power. Okay, so from the very early days of their administration, before any of this happens, they had argued that the authorizations for the use of military force, which were created to respond to 9/11, could be interpreted very expansively on a global battlefield, right? And so, even though ISIS didn't actually exist when that was written, they argued that it fell under that resolution. They don't need to go to Congress. They don't need to have a new authorization for the use of military force to send people. And oh, by the way, it's not really war, right? We're sending advisors, right? We're not sending boots on the ground, they would say, because special forces guys apparently go around on hoverboards or something, And there's one sort of guys like me famous press conference with I think a Pentagon spokesperson, where one of these guys had been in combat, and he's like, well, yes, some of our troops have ended up in combat, but we're not sending troops into combat. It's like sometimes they end up in a combat situation, but we're not sending troops into combat, right? It's like not being pregnant. You have a pregnancy situation, I guess. And so we're ramping up our military aid, and we're doing an air war. We're killing people, right? Dropping bombs, airstrikes immediately, but we're telling the American public that we're not at war. I was at an event in 2015 in Washington, D.C., where the Secretary Susan Rice told an assembled group of like 3- and 4-star generals, about a dozen severely injured troops, what have you, as we're like really ramping up our efforts in Iraq. Mike Mullen was there. The Obama administration, one of our proudest accomplishments is ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? And somebody in the audience went, and Obama said the same thing at a fundraiser, right? So it was this bizarre thing where we were radically increasing what we were doing lethally in Iraq, while telling people or trying to tell people, didn't really fly ultimately, that we weren't at war, okay? And using the old authorizations for the use of military force to justify not just operations in Iraq, but operations all over the world. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. So yeah, that's one of the contexts for a increasing precedent that where they were like very hesitant to put out information about things, or to allow too much access, or to publicize too much what was happening, despite the fact that we were engaged in a pretty intense war, where we were directly killing people. Like it wasn't like Ukraine, where we're just providing support. We had, all sorts of special operators and special forces teams on the ground who are helping direct airstrikes and such, and sometimes getting into combat themselves. Thank you.